Alright, today's fun. 2008 Dodge Ram 1500. Rear brakes. And normally brakes, if you're just changing brake pads, a pretty easy job. But thanks to the crack engineers at Chrysler, and I don't mean crack as a positive, that's an insult, as in they must have all been smoking crack when they design their vehicles, because they really do some just stupid shit. And as I get into this, I'll show you what I'm talking about. Normally when you do brakes, you just have to take the caliper off, replace the pads, put the caliper back on, and you're good to go. But for some reason, Chrysler, they designed these brakes. These are the rear brakes. I haven't got to the front ones yet. Rear brakes, you have to take this whole mount off in order to put new brake pads on, because the pads won't come out if this is left on the rotor. Again, engineering, American engineering at its finest. Also, someone in their infinite wisdom, and I'm sure it was to save money, made this brake hose coming off the brake line, hose. They made that about 5 inches long. So I'm sure they saved, $1 or so on brake lines by making them about 8 inches shorter than they need to be. But the reason that's a pain in the ass is once you get the caliper off, on most vehicles you could pull it all the way up here and maybe hang it on the frame or off, some part of the body, to get it out of your way. But with this little 5-inch hose, there's really no place you can put it, so it's in your way constantly. If you were replacing, if you had to replace the rotor or replace the bearings or something else back here, you probably have to take the caliper off and the brake line off. So now you got to bleed the brakes and you got brake fluid everywhere. It's a big mess. But Chrysler, I don't know what they're thinking. But anyways, rear brake pad replacement. Obviously you got to get the tire off. Big tire. You get the tire off. You want to jack the vehicle up to get the tire off. Jack stand for safety once you've got it jacked up. And you start to do work. First thing we're going to do is take a C-clamp and compress this cylinder. Now, here's another thing. There's no easy way to get a C-clamp on this cylinder. They put all this stuff, brake lines, and so the brake line itself is dead center of where you need to put the C-clamp. And then I assume this is to bleed the brakes, and of course this is where the caliper mounts onto this bracket. All that stuff's in the way, so you kind of have to put the clamp in at an angle. And once I get it on there, I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so the C-clamp's on there, and you can kind of see how it's on an angle, and it's kind of binding up against this bracket here. And if you look in the back, there's very little for that to bite onto. So what I'll do, I've run that in. Let me get a flashlight. I've run that in enough. You can kind of see there is a gap. Let me get the light in there. A gap between the pad and the rotor. So it's loose enough that, or between the pad and the mounting bracket, so it's loose enough I can at least get the caliper off. And then once I've got the new pads on, I'll compress that cylinder the rest of the way. It's easier to do once it's off the truck. So the next step then is to take these bolts out. That should free the caliper up to where I can get it off. Okay, so the caliper is off, and it's just laying here kind of on the axle, and you can see, I mean, that's all the room I have to do anything with this caliper. But it will lay, you know, behind the rotor on the axle. It's not too bad. This side, as with the other side, I had to take a pry bar and pry that caliper out of there. So part of the problem is this is a 2008. These are the original pads. This truck's only got 55,000 miles on it, so there's a lot of corrosion. But part of the problem, I'll try to get this up close and hold it steady. You can see that little tab right here on the caliper, and that fits over this piece right here, which is what your pad rides on, and it fits down in there. So when you go to install this, you got to put the bottom in and then slide the top up over. But when you're taking this off, because of all the corrosion, that makes it a real pain in the balls, and it's hard to you know, once you've taken out the two bolts that hold the caliper on, here's one of them, and that's a 10 millimeter, by the way. So Chrysler, they must have got a deal on 10 millimeter bolts, because it seems like half the bolts on this vehicle are 10 millimeter. Once you take those out on a normal vehicle, say Chevy, GMC, Ford, even your foreign cars, once you take out those two bolts, the caliper is just kind of hanging in there, and it just comes right out. Not the case on these rear brakes on Dodge Ram. You take those two bolts out and that caliper doesn't even move. You have to kind of tap it with a hammer, get a pry bar in there and start working it loose, until finally you're able to get that top to come out. And it probably wouldn't be as bad if you could get that cylinder, and you can see it's still got a good 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch travel where it could be pressed in. So having that right up against the pads, which are right up against the rotor, so you can see here, you know, trying to pull that out against all of this is just making it that much more difficult. But as I showed you earlier, it's hard to get that compressed in with the C-clamp, given that you've got nowhere to really get a good bite with it with the C-clamp. But now I have to take this bracket off in order to get these pads out of here. And so I have two bolts. Here's one, there's another one on the bottom right down here, and I don't know what size these are. I'm gonna guess they're 21 millimeter, but I don't know about the rest of you, but my millimeter sockets and wrenches go up to 19, and it's bigger than that. But the good news is you can take this is a 13/16 12 point boxed in. You can wiggle it on there, get a good tight fit, and get those off. So that's what I'm gonna do now. Alright, so we got this off, and try to give you a decent look, and you can see those pads are shot. Now what's unusual, pulled the tires off the front about 3 months ago and had the brake pads, was going to put them on, took a look at them. They were in pretty good shape. So I thought, well, you know, I don't drive rough, you know, I'm not on the brakes a lot. I guess I'll wait a little longer. Well, then these rear brakes started giving me some squeaking, and they went from squeaking to grinding in about a week. And usually it's the front pads that wear out first, but not in this case, not always. But I'm gonna try to explain to you why you have to take this part off. I don't know if you can see. So normally you could slide this. This is the pad that faces, or that is on the inside of the vehicle, or towards the inside of the vehicle. Normally this would slide right out towards me, but you can see these two holes where the caliper mounts are in the way. They're not going to allow that to happen. So you flip this over and you think, okay, I'll slide both of these now that I've got it off the vehicle and the rotor's not in the way. I'll slide them both off the front. This is the part that's facing the outside of the vehicle. Well, you got this little curve here in this bracket, which allows the rotor fits in there, because it's a drum slash rotor for the emergency brake. So it's got a big hub on it, big drum, and this has to go around it. So this is in the way. As you can see, there's the edge of the pad. This is in the way of sliding them this way. So you have to kind of put them in at an angle and straighten them up from the inside. And once I get these old pads off and I start putting the new ones on, I'll show you what. Alright, so I got both pads off, and as you can see, there's not a lot of pad left there. But this side is a little better than the other side. The other side was shot, and that's the pad off the other side. On the vehicle side, it's completely gone, metal on metal, and starting to get some metal on metal right here, but not as bad, not nearly as bad as that one. So now I have those out, what I'm going to do next is, you can see on here, the brakes, the pads, they ride on that guide right there, and this is pretty corroded right there, and then there's one on the top as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean those up with some steel wool, and then I'll put some brake grease on them, and we'll get the new pads in there, and I'll show you what you have to do to get those new pads in. So these are the new pads. As you can see, they're kind of in at an angle. So what you have to do is you have to put this end in first, and you kind of have to pry up on this tab, force this end down in, and then put this in at an angle, and so that you clear these two mounting holes here and this bracket here. And then you have to wedge the top in right here on that guide, and then you have to work these and get them straight, which is not easy. I use a pry bar and stay off the pad itself, off the pad lining. Try to get into this area here, and then once I get them spread apart, I'll put this back on the rotor, and I'll use a C-clamp and press down and force these up against the rotor to get them square in there. And then I'll be able to get the caliper on. So I'm going to get these straightened up, and I'll show you what that looks like. So now I got these in here fairly straight. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and put this back over the rotor, and I'll line up these bolts here in the back, and I'll put those in, get them fairly tight, and then I'll be able to take a C-clamp and press these up tight against the rotor to square them up, because they're still not straight. They're still not quite where they need to be, but they're wedged in there so tight that you can't move them with your hand. So I'm going to get that done. I'll show you what it looks like. So I've got this mounted back on, the two big bolts here in the back, and try to get a decent shot of this. So you can see that the pad that's closest to me right here is not even touching the rotor, and then this one is kind of at a little bit of an angle, so it's real close here, but on this back side over here there's a gap because it's a little crooked. So what I'll do, I'm going to take my C-clamp and put on here and compress these in until they're squared up. The way they are right now, even if I fully compress this cylinder here, I'm not going to be able to fit the caliper over these new pads. So I got to get them pressed in up against the rotor and get them in there square, and then they'll be able to travel on those rails, which these are so tight. I'm a little concerned with they're going to wear pretty fast, because they're going to get pressed in, and I don't think they're going to be free enough to release very well off of that rotor, which will wear them down pretty quick. But I don't know, it's Chrysler, what can you say? But I'll go ahead and take that clamp and run those in, and then I'll compress that cylinder the rest of the way, and we'll go from there. Alright, so I got those pressed in nice and flush with the rotor, and what I'm going to do now is I've taken the caliper I set on this jack stand, and I need to run the cylinder in order to get the caliper to fit over these new pads. And so the way I'll do that is I'll take this old pad and I'll set it down in here, and I take my C-clamp and now, because this caliper is upside down, I have a little bit of bite right there on the underside of the brake hose, and so now I'll just run this in, compressing that cylinder all the way. So I'm going to tighten this clamp up against that old pad and run that cylinder in. Okay, so now you can see the difference between the last few frames and now. That cylinder is fully compressed. So now I'll try to do this with one hand. I can loosen up the C-clamp, take it off, take this old pad off, and the cylinder should, or the caliper should, slide over these new pads fairly easily. So we got plenty of room, and similar to the way that you took it off, you've got to, I don't know if you can see, I'm trying to get it close up, you've got that little tab right there, you've got to get it down, and on the other side of that guide for your brake pads, and then slide the caliper up. It's not easy to do with one hand, and then work it in. There, like that. Now, take these 2 bolts, and they should be lined up fairly well. These you should be able to finger tighten most of the way, so you want to make sure that you've got a lot of threads biting before you throw a wrench on there. And last thing you want to do is cross thread that caliper, because then you probably have to buy a new one. So we got the top one in, and down here on the bottom, wiggle it around, start feeding it in. Like I said, turn these in by hand as much as you can. And then find your 10mm wrench, and I'll start on the bottom one down here. Tighten it up. These don't have to be super tight. Get that jack stand back here where it belongs. There we go. That's the bottom one. And get on the top one here. Let's turn this wrench around. Tighten this up. Like I said, it don't have to be real tight. There we go. So, new pads are on. Now, tire back on, which in this particular truck, it's our 17-inch rims with 35s on them. Not the easiest tires to put back on a vehicle, but they sure look good. They're a pain in the ass to take on and off. Pretty heavy, about 100 pounds per. Hard to get them lined up, lift them up and get them lined up, but that's the price you pay, right? So get the tire back on. Always use a star pattern to tighten the lugs. Tighten those up snug. Remove the jack stand, drop the jack, and then tighten them up the rest of the way using the same pattern. So that's rear brake pads. They needed it. Done.